Good evening. I'm Trevor Pinfold, and this is Monty Williams, and this is Eyewitness News. Our next story discusses the destruction of culture by the British colonial settlers in the name of assimilation. Human rights abuses were colonial assumptions about the racial inferiority of Aboriginal people of Australia. Many of their harms against Aboriginal peoples relied on law for their legitimacy. Many were essentially aimed at destroying Indigenous cultures. They were cultural harms in the broadest sense.
Why, yes, Trevor. We've invited several experts to join us here tonight and help clarify some of the key concepts in order for our audience to better understand. Joining us here tonight is Donald Seymour. Donald Seymour. Oh, why thank you there, Monty. I'd just like to say that when we speak of Indigenous people, we are really referring to a group of people who are said to be the original inhabitants of a particular region that has experienced European colonisation and subsequent marginalisation. Prior to engagements with colonial settlers, they were a people who shared language, culture, and traditions spanning generations. A perfect example are the Aboriginals of Australia. They are a group of people who have inhabited Australia for over 30,000 years. However, as an impact of colonisation, the shared identity of the Aboriginal people became relational to that of the British colonials. It is through the oppression and subjugation that they understand their value, and alienation explained and depicted through law that an existence is acknowledged and defined by the state. This is understood through Karl Marx's description of the evil of capitalist society, where the working class is granted their worth through their participation in labour. The Aboriginals' worthiness is granted in their relationship to established, alienating laws of society, where in this case the presented goal is that of citizenship in the hope of equality. Thus, the control of Indigenous people is achieved at the attempted eradication and denial of Indigenous laws and practices in the application of state laws and systems.
Mr. Seymour, what do you have to say on the concept of colonisation?
Why, thank you there, Monty. I would just like to say that colonisation is the systematic pursuit of economic prosperity involving the annexation of native land for European settlers at the expense of the Indigenous population. Colonialism is essentially driven by a Eurocentric vision in which European, Western, Greco-Roman traditions are considered superior to the traditions of Indigenous populations. Colonialism is genocidal in nature, in which Indigenous people become socioeconomically disadvantaged and their weaknesses are subsequently exploited. In Australia, a gentle genocide through enforced eugenics was implemented as a consequence of prolific European and Aboriginal sexual conduct. This colonial issue became known as the half-caste problem, which was feared by white Australia as the future haunting of a dying race. In an attempt to reverse the process, an absorption of the black population into the white population was undertaken. This program of social engineering involved the active removal of colour from both body and mind, and was considered to be the holy grail of solutions to the forever looming half-caste problem. By controlling sexual relations of mature Aboriginals and forcefully removing Aboriginal children from their families, the Eurocentric-driven state thought it was achieving a civilised society.
Our next respective guest expert is Peter Malarky. Thank you, Trevor. The state is defined by liberal democratic principles based on the Western European regulation of the rule of law. The destruction and dispossession of Indigenous societies and cultures is achieved by the colonial subjugation of institutionalised racial discrimination by the centralised body of government known as the colonial state. Cultural values and law of Indigenous nations are in opposition to the values represented by colonial law and are trumped by that of the mightier sword of the Western state. The state's denial of Indigenous sovereignty is achieved through the enforcement of policy for domination and legislative governance to rebuke the rights of the Aboriginal. For example, the proposition of an advancement in welfare for the original population is presented in a polarising and uncompromising ultimatum. Membership of the community of colonials on the terms chosen by the state, or an exclusion from civilization as a whole. Donald Seymour, this is for you. The concept of criminal justice, please.
Criminal justice is an exercising of the power of the state to address criminal behaviour as defined by the law as stated within the modern justice system. For Indigenous society, this is seen as intensive regulatory control implemented in the name of protection and assimilation by colonial governments. For example, in Australia, within controlled reserves of Aboriginal populations, penal regimes were established. Reserve superintendents were appointed at the helm of control by the establishment of the Queensland Aboriginal Preservation and Protection Act 1939. As per the Act, local police were under their control and they could comprise themselves as the voice of a court, therefore able to exercise wide power under their own discerning decisions. This Act allowed for merciless and unfair action undertaken by superintendents where sentences of imprisonment were common and simply enforced when an individual seemed uncontrollable. Permission of Aboriginals needed to be sought in order to leave a reserve well into the mid-1950s, and if permission was not granted, the escapee was charged with desertion. As an Aboriginal in a reserve, they were commonly referred to as inmates.
Peter, can you shed light on the crimes concept for the viewers at home? Yes, Trevor. Crimes are seen simply by the modern criminal justice systems and Indigenous societies as breaches of criminal laws or codes of an agreed-upon system. However, during colonial times, racial discourses flared differentiate views of punishment. This process of differentiating is illustrated by the use of the death penalty in Australia. Legislatively, in 1871, the Western Australian Parliament stated that executions must be undertaken within prison walls, formally banning public executions, although an amendment in legislation allowed for the public execution of Aboriginal people, remaining in legislation until repeal in 1952, and overrepresentation of Aboriginal people was evident in death sentences at the time. Ka kite anō, and a very good evening indeed.